Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Andy Barnett. I'm Director at NSF International Pharma Biotech Group. And as you can see from the slide, I have a lot of experience with investigations, not only conducting investigations, but also providing training, coaching, mentoring, and at quite a few sites I've also served as a third-party reviewer. So I'm happy to share some of the insights I've gained over the years, but first we have a few logistics. This webinar will be recorded, and you'll receive a link sometime after the conference has ended. In case you miss anything, you can always use the link and hear it again. Also, there's a chat box in the lower left corner. Feel free to submit any questions you may have during the webinar. We'll try to leave a few minutes at the end to answer some of your questions, but rest assured if I don't have time to answer all of the questions, I'll address them individually. So our agenda for today, we'll start out talking about the FDA emphasis on investigations. We've looked at a lot of warning letters over the past few years to gain insights into understanding what the FDA expects. So we'll start with that. And then the big challenge for us is how do we communicate what we've learned with our organization. So quite a few slides on that. And then toward the end, I'll present a brief case study. And we'll end with questions and answers. All right, so diving right into the material, this first slide has a question in the center of the graphic. What is the most frequently cited finding in recent FDA warning letters? Well, an educated guess would be investigations. After all, that's the topic for today. But if we ask that same question, say 15 years ago, the answer might be different. Back then, there's a lot of emphasis on validation, and a lot of companies over the past 10 years or so have really strengthened their validation systems, and so that's much less frequent. There's one dark horse on this slide, and that's data integrity. It's really been surging in the last few years. The FDA has gotten much better at identifying or detecting problems with data integrity. So that's something to watch. Definitely is surging. So the basis for this slide is 171 pharma warning letters issued between 2013 and 2017. And as you can see, the most frequent finding is investigations are inadequate. And that's 53%. More than half of all warning letters include a finding for poor investigations. Number 2 on the list is basically missing records. And you can see at the bottom of the list, data integrity. Don't be fooled by how far down on the list it is, because as I mentioned, it's really started to surge in the last few years. So what does the FDA expect based on a review of all these warning letters? Of course, number 1, the first bullet point, investigate all complaints, deviations, out of spec events, and so forth. That practically goes without saying. But the next couple of bullet points are sort of a heads up. With the emphasis of the FDA on data integrity, they're looking more at aborted runs, runtime anomalies, aberrant peaks, and so forth with respect to chromatography and other chemistry type assays. And also environmental monitoring data. I encourage you at the very least to be trending alerts and investigating action excursions. So that's also sort of a rising trend within the FDA. The next area is to define the scope. I can tell you after reading so many warning letters. This is really important. The FDA will cite you if you don't define the scope of your investigation. So there's a few questions I've listed there. Has it happened before? Are other batches affected? Does it possibly affect other processes or products? The next critical element is a risk assessment. This is required per ICH Q9. The FDA adopted it about 10 years ago. And one key thing to remember there is always focus on patient impact. Include at least one sentence discussing what the patient impact is. Of course, the most important thing in an investigation is to drive to the root cause. Let me just say recently at one of my clients, I heard the phrase for the first time, blame and train. So if your investigation determines that it was an operator error or something like that, and your corrective action is retraining, just be aware that that's probably going to be considered an inadequate investigation. You need to dig deeper. So training is often necessary, but generally not sufficient. So keep that in mind. With respect to the KAPA, it's always good to make sure that you link the KAPA to the root cause. And effectiveness checks. I can tell you that many people struggle with effectiveness checks. So my advice is keep it simple. What will you measure? When will you measure it? And what is your acceptance standard? If you hit those 3 points, you should be fine with effectiveness checks. Here's a typical warning letter statement: failure to adequately investigate complaints and extend the investigation to other batches that may have been affected. So there's an example of a finding that involves scope. So once again, let me just emphasize how important it is to consider the scope in your investigation report. Now the big challenge for us is gaining this understanding of what the FDA expects. How do we communicate that out to our organization? And this is something I've worked on for about 30 years. And based on my experience and my insights, I recommend that you adopt these 6 mandatory elements. And I'll talk about each. I have a slide for each one of these mandatory elements, and we'll talk about each one in detail. I also put a scoring system on this. I found that by putting a scoring system linked to each one of these mandatory elements, the people understand how their investigation report fell short, and they can make corrective improvements on future reports. So the first one is the problem statement. I suggest that you keep this short, accurate, simple, understandable by layman. Now, what do I mean by short? I would suggest a maximum of 1 page. If you can't describe the problem in less than a page, you need to work on the problem statement some more. It should have some of these basic elements: who, what, when, where, what equipment was involved, if possible, what specification was not met, and so forth. But give facts, not speculation. We don't want to read a problem statement and they've already decided what the root cause is. The determination of the root cause only comes after conducting the investigation. So that's worth 15 points. All of these scores that I present are arbitrary. There is some thought behind it. You can change them if you feel you have a reason to modify the score slightly. All right, the next element is the scope. That's worth 5 points. Has it happened before? Does it affect other batches, other products, other processes, other sites, and so forth? So be sure to include some discussion about that. A lot of companies get hit specifically for this issue. They didn't expand the problem. They didn't consider the impact on other batches and so forth. Now, once in a while, you'll have a complex problem. Maybe there's an issue with an SOP, and maybe there's issue with the software backing it up. You may decide as an organization that you want to split the investigation into two parts. One part would focus on updating the SOP, and the other part would focus on the IT aspects that need to be corrected. So if you do that, just make sure that you declare what is out of scope in whatever investigation you're doing, and include some justification such as referencing a separate investigation. Next is the risk assessment, and that's worth 5 points. As I already mentioned, it's really important to focus on the patient impact. So what I suggested to people is consider if this, whatever the problem is that you're investigating, if it got out to the field and was administered to a patient, what would happen to the patient? A lot of companies use an FMEA-based scoring system. It includes severity, frequency, and detection to determine overall risk, and you can put that into low, medium, or high categories. But remember that the level of due diligence, the thoroughness of your investigation, should always be commensurate with the overall risk. So if it's a low-risk problem, it may be sufficient to identify the probable root cause. You don't need convincing proof for a low-risk problem. But on the high-risk problems, you need to dig quite a bit deeper, put more effort into the investigation, and make sure your conclusions are well-founded in the facts. Now, risk assessment is required per ICH Q9. As I mentioned, it's adopted by the FDA about 10 years ago. So a lot of companies get hit for this. Just make sure you include a risk assessment. The next section is the root cause analysis, and that's worth 35 points. It's the most important piece. The whole purpose of the investigation is to get to the root cause and identify an effective corrective action. So within this section, you want to look at applying various tools, and I usually allow investigators to have complete discretion on what tools they apply. After all, not every investigation is the same. Some tools work better for certain types of problems than others, so I leave that to the discretion of the investigator. You want to drive to a potential root cause, show some kind of logical approach that you arrive at. What was your process, what you explored, and how you arrived at the conclusion. And then, this is also important, link the root cause to the corrective or preventive action you're going to take. I can't tell you the number of investigations I've reviewed where I'm convinced they found a root cause, but I can't for the life of me figure out how they came up with the KAPA. So make sure that you link the root cause and explain how it will address the root cause in your KAPA actions. Analyzing data, this is also important, especially if you've had multiple events. Make sure that you apply various tools. And again, I allow the investigator to have a lot of discretion. What tools work the best? Pareto charts, fishbone, bar charts, tables, and so forth. The whole point is to help identify patterns that can help you identify the root cause. All right. Next is the overall report quality. That's worth 15 points. Pardon me. You want to tell the story. This is the one area of my criteria that I think is a little more subjective than others. But nevertheless, it's really important. You need to be able to tell a story that makes sense years later. 2 or 3 years from now, an FDA investigator may pick up your investigation. You want to make sure that it's explained well enough so that you don't need a subject matter expert to come in and explain it. It should have a clear conclusion. Next is a robust KAPA. That's worth 5 points. Will the KAPA be effective? That's an important question. And is it tied to the root cause? So when it comes to effectiveness checks, again, let me mention these 3 questions. What will you measure? When will you measure it? And what's your acceptance standard? If you have those 3 elements, you should be fine with effectiveness checks. Now, let me mention that in rare cases, you don't need a KAPA. You may have taken immediate corrective actions at the beginning of the investigation, and that should be sufficient, so no additional actions are required. If that's the case, be sure that you provide justification and include an explicit statement in the body of the investigation saying that no additional actions are needed. Now, I mentioned that that's rare cases, so how would I define that? Well, in my experience, maybe around 5% of the investigations don't need a KAPA. But there's sort of an expectation that you put a KAPA out there on everything. So if you're not going to put a KAPA in, just make sure you have a statement saying that the actions already taken are sufficient. Now, I strongly recommend that you implement a temporary coaching or mentoring process. Let me emphasize that this should be temporary. I'm not recommending a permanent addition to your quality staff. Find someone within your organization, or if necessary, find someone outside the organization that can provide, in effect, a third-party review. And as an organization, decide what a minimum passing score is. So we've assigned scores, the 6 mandatory elements. If you add up all those points, it sums to 100. So let's say you decide 80% is a good passing score. As part of the review, provide written feedback to the investigator with specific instructions on how to improve the scores. And I think you'll find if you implement this process that the scores will improve significantly. And once the investigators consistently demonstrate a passing score, then this temporary coaching can go away. Also, I recommend that you include the reviewers and approvers. I think I think this is essential that they be on board with the expectations. So once you prepare written feedback to the investigators, be sure to send a copy to the reviewers and approvers. It's important that they also understand what the expectations are. And then they can push back as needed. They can push back to the investigator and say, you need to add more information on risk assessment or whatever is needed in a particular investigation. So this is really also, I think, really important. I'll spend a few minutes talking about a case study. This is a client I had a couple of years ago. It was a medium-sized biopharma client. They had multiple sites, and they were generating around 1,000 medium to high-risk investigations per year. The quality of the investigations were poor, and to a large extent, the KAPAs were ineffective. And this was costing the organization around $25 million a year. So, big impact. So the actions we took included a 2-day root cause training course at every site. But not only did we train the investigators, but we also trained the reviewers and approvers. And we did implement this third-party review process, which provided coaching and mentoring to the investigators. And once the written feedback was prepared, we shared it with one-on-one with the investigator. Once they were satisfied that the feedback was correct, then we shared it with the reviewers and approvers. Here's a sample feedback form. You can see the 6 mandatory categories on the left, a score in the middle, and then comments. So if the investigator did not achieve the full possible score, then we gave comments on how they could improve their score on future investigations. Now this is a slide that shows the results. You can see that before we trained, the average score was around 62. This particular client decided that a score of 80 was an acceptable score. And I can tell you that the first 65 or so investigations that we reviewed all failed to meet that 80% threshold. Once we conducted the training, the scores jumped significantly. The average score went up to about 68 or 70, and a small percentage of the investigations started to pass. Then the third-party feedback was implemented, coaching and mentoring the investigators, and the scores jumped quite significantly again after that. The most recent data, now the third-party reviews have been discontinued, but I can tell you that the last 50 or so investigations that were submitted, 100% of them met the minimum score of 80. So I have to say that implementing this process worked extremely well. I've been doing this for a long time, and I can honestly say that I've never seen the quality of investigation reports improve so fast, so much and so fast as since I implemented this new process. So it works really well. So in summary, I think the key is to communicate your expectations. It sounds so simple, but it's so powerful. If people know what to expect, they'll deliver. The scores will just improve. Continue that feedback until the scores improve to the level that you're satisfied with. And don't forget to include the reviewers and approvers. There's an upcoming webinar that I want to mention. It's a follow-on to this webinar. It'll be on July 11th at 11 a.m. Follow-up webinar, applying the KAPA hierarchy. So wouldn't it be nice if we could look at a KAPA when it is submitted and have a good sense for whether or not the KAPA will be effective? Instead of waiting 3 or 6 months for it to be implemented, and then we find out the KAPA was not effective and we have to reopen the investigation. Wouldn't it be nice to know ahead of time? Well, this webinar on July 11th will help you understand how to evaluate KAPAs before they're implemented. I recommend that you pursue that. There's contact information here, not only my email address, but a couple of other people in our organization. So if you have additional questions, if you hadn't submitted the questions already in the talk box, then you can email me directly and I'll do my best to answer your questions. So we do have a couple of minutes for questions. Me looking through the questions, and here's an interesting question. The person says 20 points seems like a lot, like it's too high for the problem statement and the scope. Wouldn't it make sense to put more emphasis on the KAPA and effectiveness check? Well, that's a great point. And this exact question generated a lot of discussion at one of my recent clients. So let me begin, or let me say again, that you have discretion. If you think the scoring system should be modified, it'll fit your organization better, by all means go ahead and adjust the scores. But the reason that we put so much emphasis on this is that the problem statement drives everything else. That's why it's so important. My experience as a Master Black Belt in Six Sigma, the number one reason investigations fail is that the problem statement is poorly defined. If the problem statement is too broad, it's impossible to fix. You can't fix the whole world with one investigation. Also, if the problem statement is too narrow, then the benefits are quite limited. So it's really important to have the problem statement well defined. And that's why, even though it's a small part of the work involved in the investigation, we think because it drives everything that follows, it's so important, and as a result, we put more points in that section. But of course, you're free to adjust it as you see fit. There's a second question. You mentioned that data integrity is surging in warning letters. Can you share more information? I can tell you that NSF recently had a data integrity webinar. It was about a month ago. You can reach out to us using the contact screen, and we'll send you a link to that webinar. We also have a white paper you can download if you're interested in reading the white paper. We have other topics, and again, let me remind you that this webinar is recorded, so you can log on later after we send the link and listen to it a second time if you wish. You can also reach out to me. Anybody that's submitted questions, additional questions that I did not address, I will make an effort within the next few days to respond individually to you. So thanks again. I hope you found this webinar useful. And with that, I'll stop the meeting. Thanks again for attending.